Okay, thank you very much, Greg, for that presentation. After your presentation, I have nothing to say because it's very difficult to accomplish all the expectation maybe that some of you have about my work. But it's a great pleasure to be here after that conference that I came many years ago. I met Christophe and we were in contact in one way or another, also with Greg, and especially to be here at the Rachel Carson that is very famous for us. And this project is connected with the Rachel Carson in many ways, and that's why I want to present. This is a big presentation, how to do it in 20 minutes or more or less, a little more maybe. And I'm trying to combine the history that I'm doing with the historiography of the region, just to give you an idea, but very, very general, and some of my ideas about this project. Well, thank you again, Greg, for the presentation. That was the official beginning, because many people in one way or another invite me many times to produce something about the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is something difficult to define as a concept, no? And it's something that I'm trying to do also in this work. I wrote a chapter for this book. Here is the title. And it was a challenge, but how to connect the history of so many islands, so many countries around the basin. And sometimes people ask me to talk just about the islands, other times about this case more broadly. And it was a challenge, but I am happy, very happy. And I always, because I think history is always a process, no? And then I started this many years ago. I continue. I don't know when I will finish this book. I hope soon, because it's a synthesis, as I mentioned. I think the Caribbean is a really interesting place. I'm sure that everybody considers their topic as a very important place also, their region, no? But here are some of the general ideas about why it's so important, the Caribbean. Because the connection with the history of colonialism and imperialism, the area for the cash crop economies, the plantation, but now today, because the rise of mass tourists in the last decades, and because the slavery, the sugar cane, because two of the most important, I consider the most important social revolution happened in this area, the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century and the Cuban Revolution more recent. And because the impact of many natural disturbances as hurricane, earthquake, drought, yes, many reasons why it's so important to connect this region. Then we are talking about the Caribbean Sea in particular, and all the areas surrounding the Caribbean Sea, and I will explain what is my own definition of the greater Caribbean. Another concept that I want to explore, to use more here in this book, is the tropicality. We know this is a concept that is more developed maybe for the East Asia, but I think the Caribbean is one of the symbols of the tropicality in many, many ways. But the ideas about the tropicality are, let's say, are so general that put together many things that's not fit what really is the tropics. And the diversity of the tropics is very important in this case, talking about the Caribbean, because, for example, we have these mountains here, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. We have even snow in the Caribbean. And also the diversity of the region in general. Many people consider the Caribbean just a tropical island with coconut trees, with the banana trees, and the lowland, and it's much more complex, even in the same island of the Caribbean. Most of the islands are more mountainous than lowland, than flat landscape. Okay, all these perception and ideas about tropicality will be very important in this project, from the negative tropicality to a positive tropicality ideas. Okay, here in general, some of I think it's something important. Then the definitions about the Caribbean. We have many definitions, many conceptualizations on the Caribbean. Here is one of the most famous that he gives 4 definitions. The insular Caribbean or ethnohistoric Caribbean that consider the islands and just few places. That is the vision of the Caribbean for most of the people because that came mainly for the British Academy. And then they include the islands and Belize and the Guyanas. And why not the other countries in the same Caribbean Sea, no? Caribbean Basin. The geopolitical Caribbean, because the relation between the Caribbean and the United States, I think maybe is the most important to understand the Caribbean after the 19th century. And there is the so-called contra-hegemonic idea of the Caribbean that consider also this idea of the greater Caribbean, not just the island, but just also the continent. And the ideas of Afro-America. And then some people consider as part of the Caribbean, the northeast of Brazil, the south of the United States is a very, very big, greater Caribbean. But I think, for me, I don't like that very broad definition for different reasons. And I prefer to focus more my attention on that same region, and I try to explain why I decide. Here, some of the book, for example, when you talk about the relation with the United States, there is also the American Mediterranean. Because the influence of the United States, but before we had also the Spanish Empire, the role of Mexico, for example, and all these ideas connecting the Gulf and the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. Here, some of the examples. And now we have also an association of the Caribbean state that I think is very important because in some way I'm doing this work trying to help this kind of conceptualization of the Caribbean to provide an environmental history for the current discussions about sustainability, for example. And this maybe could be useful, this kind of work connecting all the region. Then you have Wikipedia, for example, that not include Mexico in within the Caribbean region. And this is something that I will discuss. There are 2 books that are very important for the conceptualization of the Caribbean, and are some precedent, as here I mentioned to the left. The book by Eric Williams, a very famous historian from Trinidad, and Juan Bosch, that was the president of Dominican Republic. And they present 2 different Caribbean, as Norman Girban from Jamaica tried to explain why these 2 books are very important. And he said that in the case of William, he followed more the Anglo-Saxon Academy, which include the islands and the continental territories of Belize and the Guyana. But in contrast, Bosch include a broader vision of the Caribbean, including the Hispanic Caribbean, the countries in South America, not El Salvador because it's in the Pacific Ocean. And it's more or less that definition. Is these 2 books, according Girban, form a hybrid that would give rise to the consolidation of the concept of the Greater Caribbean and the institutional expression in the Association of Caribbean countries. Here are some of the samples of some books, but in general, the books are only about the islands and these other places in the rest of the Caribbean basin. Or from Spain, for example, they prefer to use the term the Antilles. And the Antilles are the islands also, no? And it's something that we can follow in the bibliography about the Caribbean. In fact, many people are doing this that I'm trying to do in my book, that from slavery to services. And in this case, Bulmer Thomas, that is a very famous economic historian in UK, he followed the traditional conceptualization, including the island and few places in the continent. My framework for this work are the islands, but also the region within the continent that are considered Caribbean for every of the countries. I hope to do that because in the book I will use that cases, not a case from other region that the same countries in the continent not considered as part of the Caribbean. And I explain what places in every of the countries around the Caribbean basin. And here, for example, you can see in Costa Rica, this is an example for Costa Rican geographies or other books, that is the Caribbean in Costa Rica. In Colombia, the same. And they have a very, very deep definition about what is the Caribbean within Colombia and what is not the Caribbean. And this is something that I want to develop more in my work. Okay, here some of the books about the Central American side of the Caribbean, some of the samples. One of this geographer from Germany, very important to know more about that region. And books that are producing from the different areas, different countries in the Caribbean. And it's interesting because they use the metaphor of the island. They say that these places in the countries within the continent are island within their broad countries. And it's something interesting how they use the same metaphor of the island. Okay, talking more about the history, I think the region was very well connected even before Columbus' arrival, but since the Columbus' arrival also was part of the Spanish Empire, mainly since the 16th century, and from the beginning was very well connected, all the region. And it's something that I think we need to take in consideration, yes, from the sailing boats to the steamboat was an area maybe compared with other areas around the world, very well connected through the sea. And when we know all the history about the piracy and all the histories about the contraband in this area, in the fight, in the struggle between the different empires for this region, but also the connection between the different empires, the British, the French, the Denmark, even Sweden. They had colonies in this region that these colonies were connected also with the Spanish colonies in the region. And that's to the present. For example, this is a map from the Great White Fleet that can explain very well why this area was so connected in one way or another for this for the steamboat since the end of the 19th century. We need to consider also the sea within this history and the maritime borders that we know that are recent from the 70s in advance, but that made a huge difference. Because an island that maybe is seen as something very small now is maybe a big country because include the sea. Here is the relation between the sea land and the inland in many of the cases. In Barbados, it's more than 100 times bigger now that include the sea surrounding Barbados. And it's something that we need to consider in one way or another also in this history to incorporate more the sea. And I'm trying to find connections. The ecological region, for example, the role of the mangrove in the whole area. Some species, as the mahogany, for example, we have here the Honduran mahogany, but we had also the Spanish or Dominican mahogany, for example, that was more in the island, and that created some of the first economies in that region, and that was common between the islands and the continent. And we have already books about this topic. The turtle, for example, all the economies around the use of the turtles for food or for other uses, and how the turtle connect also the region. This economy started in the Cayman Island, but was moved later to other places around the Caribbean Sea, and then was part of the increasing consumption of this turtle, first as a luxury, and then for the mass consumption. The crocodiles, for example, is something that never appeared in the history, but I think it's very important. For example, here to give you an idea, that was a very common industry at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. That's I want to incorporate more this kind of topic within this history, briefly, of course. But was common in the continent and in some of the island with crocodiles, of course. And this is more complex history. Okay, also the manatee, the flamingo, some of the species that are common in the islands and in the continent. In the environmental history, also we have the same situation as the historiography in general. Most of the books are focused on the British concept of the Caribbean or the US concept in many ways, and that include just the island and few places within the continent. And here are two of the samples. Other books use the concept of the Greater Caribbean using some countries in the Caribbean, in the island, and other countries in the continent as a state of nature. Mosquito empires that use the greater Caribbean, including part of the United States, as the Sea of a Storm by Stuart Schwartz, that also include a broad region. Here is a recent book with some of the topic that I will not develop so much in my own work. For example, the health, the disease histories, and also the disaster, no, in general, because I can't depart from this kind of work. Then, talking very generally about my ideas, I think one of the start points, of course, the colonization, the demographic collapse, all the classic topics on environmental history, but mainly from the beginning of the so-called pre-industrial, or for some author, proto-industrial slavery plantations in the British and French island mainly. And it's the history of the 17th, 18th century that put maybe more the Caribbean within the histories of the plantation or the world economy, and with some characteristic that I will develop in my work that was mainly in the island, the British, the French, and other European empire, not so much in the Hispanic Caribbean, with some innovation, because we're very small island. The question of scale is very important in my work, because the so-called sugar revolution started in Barbados. It's only 400 kilometers square. And it's a very small place, but so many, very, very important in that moment. And it's something that I will develop also along the work. Okay, so innovation, because the environment influence in this kind of innovation from the beginning of the 18th century, in particular, how the plantation was moving first from this very small in the minor Antilles to the Haiti and Jamaica as a symbol of the pre-industrial or proto-industrial plantations in the Caribbean. And we know the most famous books are produced about this region, and many other books about the history of science, for example, or medicine. And we have a huge literature about that moment in the history of the Caribbean. But we need to consider the other side also, the role of the livestock economy, the role of the animals, the connection between the smaller and the larger major Antilles, and it's something that I want to incorporate also more within this history. Okay, this picture maybe is a synthesis, a lot of need of human labor, the use of animal, the use of wind power, the use of the water also, mills, and it's representative, this picture, maybe from that kind of plantations before the 19th century. And that changed completely when the plantation moved from that island to bigger islands as Cuba in the 19th century. I call this the beginning of the industrial agriculture, the real industrial agriculture in the tropics, in connection with the first industrial revolution and in connection with the United States in particular. And this is a classical landscape of the biggest plantations in Cuba 19th century. It seems a factory in the tropics. And I think this is very important to understand all this long history about the Caribbean, the role of Cuba in that particular moment, also Puerto Rico, and of course the environmental consequence, implication of this move to the biggest islands in the Caribbean. And because most of the time we know the history about the decline of the plantation economies in the 19th century, but that was in the British and French island, not in the Hispanic island. This is the so-called today the second slavery, and there are many authors working on this concept. Then the role of the mechanization. You see here the increase in the sugar production in Cuba during this time, during the 19th century, and the use of the steam power, the steam machines, for example, in the sugar mills in Cuba. And that, but not only the steam machines, also the railroad that was introduced very early in Cuba, first from European technology, but immediately after by the U.S. Technology. And you see here, for example, Cuba, the kilometers of a railroad line compared with the whole South America and other continents. And how important was the connection with the United States. That was important also before in the 18th century, but here you see Cuba as the first trade partner in the whole Latin America with the United States during the 19th century. I call this also how the Caribbean was incorporated to the industrial metabolism of the United States. And here some of the books about this period that I will use, talking about this connection between the slavery plantations and the new technologies of the Industrial Revolution. Then we have a new period under the second Industrial Revolution, the generalization of the technologies as the railroad, not just to bring the sugar to the harbor, to the port, to export, but just to bring the sugar cane to the factories. The factories bigger and bigger, and with a huge presence of the U.S. corporation in this process, not just in Cuba, also in Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, the so-called American Sugar Kingdom. And this is important, and I use the concept of the conquest of the tropic for this period from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, and in particular in relation with the United States, because this area was the closer tropics to the United States. And we know what means this concept of the conquest of the tropic, no? And the use of the racialized labor force, and all the process that start from that close relation with the United States. Something very important in this idea of the conquest of the tropic was the mosquitoes, the discovery of the transmission of the yellow fever that helped in one way or another to that idea about the conquest of the tropic. Gorgas, for example, who was first in Cuba during the U.S. occupation and after in Panama Canal, he wrote, "I believe that our work in Cuba and Panama will then be looked on as the earliest demonstration that the white man could flourish in the tropic." And that idea about the conquest of the tropic was present everywhere. This is a book about the banana plantation. That is the newest stage on the plantation economy around the Caribbean, and I want to find the continuities between the sugar plantation in the island and the banana plantations in the continent. It still was very important, that sugar economy. For example, this is a quote of a geographer in the 20s. He said, Cuba, we trade more with Cuba than with China. And that gives you also the sense of scale, how the scale of this industrial economy changed along to the present. And then that continuity of the same part, of course, not just was sugar, also coffee in some areas, the bananas mostly in the continent, but the bananas with the small farm in the islands. At the same time, cocoa, for example, that was also important, and some of the economies around the animals that I mentioned before. Then we have a process of specialization, intensification of the plantation economy, and here the other symbol of the plantation economy more centered on the continental side of the Caribbean, but still with many things in common with the traditional sugar plantation in the 19th century or even before, and with a lot of labor force from the same island in the Caribbean basin. And some authors defend the same idea that this was a continuation of the traditional plantation economy. Here we have some of the books about the plantation, about the banana plantation. This is about the Hennequén plantation in Yucatan, because I am thinking to include Yucatan as part of this broad region, Caribbean region, for many reasons. Other books about the same period, the same ideas, for example, American Tropics, that is under the umbrella of that concept, the concept that I'm planning to use, the conquest of the tropics, and then a new period that came more or less around the Second World War. is the new period of the substitution of the animal labor in the agricultural sector of plantations. And it's something that we need to include also in terms of the use of animals, for example, to increase the dairy farms instead of beef cattle ranches, and the development age as a new age that we need to incorporate more to the histories about the Caribbean, because most of the histories ends in the 19th century or maybe the beginning of the 20th century. And we need to incorporate more this new stage, the so-called Great Acceleration. What are the implications of this new age to the Caribbean, all the ideas about the development. Here an example from Cuba, for example. After the revolution, mainly, the increase in the use of energy to maintain the plantation the plantation system, and that is different from before. That depend more on the destruction of the forest first, on the deforestation. No? The input that was necessary to incorporate to the system to maintain the production of sugar or bananas or other crops in the same region. The use of the increasing mechanization also. The use of fertilizers, for example. Also, the move from the focus on beef to the focus on dairy farm. This was a famous Cuban cow that brought the record to 2 American cows. And this is something really that I like to defend, no? Because it's a symbol of that shift from the beef to the dairy as part of these ideas about nutrition, about how to feed more people with milk, eggs, or other source of animal protein. But it's a common history. For example, here in Puerto Rico, monuments dedicated to the dairy farms. And the change in many patterns, the continuous urbanization of the region after the Second World War. Here, the case of Puerto Rico, that maybe is one of the most extreme cases. Here, some comparison with Cuba. And the level of urbanization is huge in Puerto Rico. And we can ask, okay, is that sustainable now? And it's something also that we need to include briefly in this long history, because that's happening in many of the islands, less in the Caribbean, in the continent. The level depends on the city in the continent, but it's maybe less heavy. And here are some of the sample of books about this period. And I'm almost finishing. Urbanization is one of the topics more important here, and also mining. Because I'm not planning, I maybe say something about the mining at the beginning of the 16th, 17th century, but mainly in this period, this time, because bauxite, for example, nickel, and also coal in Colombia and petroleum in Venezuela, all are here in this region that not many people think how important was this energy side of the Caribbean history, how relevant is. And finally, tourism, because many people consider mass tourists today as the new plantation for the Caribbean. And it's similar maybe to other regions around the world, but maybe the Caribbean is the first example from that transition from plantation to tourism, because tourism was also an alternative to the plantation's decline. And to the ideas about tropicality is a very relevant central topic also, the discussion on tourism. And that had a long relation with plantations that came from the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in the same steamboats that bananas were brought to the United States. Tourists came to the region. That was the beginning, but not the mass tourists as in the 60s or in advance, no? And what are the implications of tourism for the Caribbean region and for the transformation of the ecological relations in the region? Because many people consider that this is a clean economy, clean industry, but demand a lot of energy, a lot of calories, a lot of importation to the region of inputs to maintain that mass tourism. And the different stage is not the same. The hotel tourist than the cruise tourist that has also many other implication. But maybe I always use this example from Germany because this is a so-called tropical island that is close to Berlin. What if the people here decide not to go to the Caribbean because they find their own ideas about the tropics here in Europe or in the United States? And it's another challenge that we confront also in this long history of idealization of the tropics. And here are some of the samples of the very useful books. And conservation. Conservation will appear in different moments, the role of conservation, the discussions about sustainability, and there are many books that I will use in my own project. And then finally, this discussion about sustainability. Because this is an index of sustainable development that was developed recently. And in this index, some of the countries in the Caribbean region are between the most developed countries, using the concept of sustainable development. It's almost always Costa Rica, Cuba, Panama, in different levels, because every country has their own characteristic. But it's interesting for me what is considered today sustainable in one way or another. But the Caribbean is there because our level of life or every other reason that we can develop, we can use. But I finish here. Thank you very much.